George R. R. Martin loves making his characters disappear, not necessarily in a puff of smoke, but as a wise man once said, death is so final, but life is so full of possibilities. When you could kill a character off, why not make their fate a lot more ambiguous? The best example I can think of from the series past is someone like Barristan Selmy. We don't think he was dead, but he was very clearly dismissed at the end of a Game of Thrones before vanishing for an entire season or an entire book, eventually cropping up with Daenerys' supporters a world away from where he started, in an unexpected twist that very much sticks to the core of the character. And I believe Martin is set up to do almost the exact same thing with another old, seasoned knight who many people love, myself included, that being the one and only Brynden Tully, the Blackfish, the uncle of Catelyn Stark and thus great uncle of all of the Stark children. Brynden vanishes in A Feast for Crows and is yet to reappear, which makes sense given that it takes place semi at the same time as A Dance with Dragons. So today, I want to go over the circumstances of Brendan's disappearance, as well as what might have happened to him, as I think there are two key possibilities that could end up signaling his eventual fate. Brynden Tully is a character who has a lot of history, and I think some of that is worth examining, as I believe it will have some impact on his future. He got his start fighting in the War of the Nine Penny Kings, this conflict that predates the main series, and in many ways acts as its primary backdrop, as all of the connections that form these relationships that are the background of the story, like Robert's Rebellion, are kind of sewn into this conflict. He's known as a hero from this point on, and we see him influence many of the characters as they're growing up, including the Tully kids like Edmure, Lysa, and Catelyn, in addition to Jaime, who really idolized the Blackfish. And this comes back around later on. However, in Robert's Rebellion, we see this kind of double arranged marriage between Catelyn and Ned, and then Lysa and Jon Arryn. And when this wedding happens, the Blackfish decides to swear for Jon Arryn and go off to fight for him, taking it as a slight. Hoster Tully, the father of Catelyn and Edmure and Lysa, very much dismisses the Blackfish from his court whatsoever, and as such, the two don't speak for many years. But this means, after the war, we see the Blackfish take up residence in the Eyrie, where he lives for pretty much the entirety of the time between that conflict and the main series, as the first time we meet him is from Catelyn's perspective, as she's arriving at the Gates of the Moon, which Brynden has now guarded for many years. I should also go into a little bit of nickname origins. The Blackfish is a play on the black sheep, or in this instance, I think he was called a black goat. But regardless of that, he was not necessarily this demonic god entity from another part of the world of Ice and Fire, as is the case with the black goat. He did point out that the Tully sigil is a fish, so he should be the black fish. But we do see the Blackfish continue on and begin to serve a more active role as the series continues, specifically taking part on Robb's campaign for the Riverlands in the north, this independence crusade that he has ended up being able to support his great nephew in. And he does a great job. He gives wise counsel to Robb throughout this entire conflict, until eventually, of course, Robb Stark and his mother, Catelyn Tully, are killed at the Red Wedding. Very tragically, might I add. But fortunately, Brynden Tully was able to escape this incident. He is one of the only survivors who was actually there for the Red Wedding, and we see him come up again in A Feast for Crows, as not only is he continuing Robb's fight, he is oftentimes viewed as sort of the last vestige, the key holdout that is preventing the Riverlands from falling into the Lannisters entirely. In A Feast for Crows, we come to River Run through Jaime's perspective. This castle, formerly the seat of the Tullys, now given to the Freys, is under siege, as Blackfish, being able to slip away from the Red Wedding, was able to get there and fortify his position, and has locked himself in there since. He was born in this hole and he's dying in this hole, as I believe was the Ice Age quote used in the Glidus piss take about one of the season 6 episodes that I've watched too many times. But regardless of that, we see an interesting conflict within Jaime at this point, because not only does he personally admire Blackfish as a person and as a warrior, we see him conflicted with this oath he had to Catelyn not to ever take up arms again against the Starks or against the Tullys. The Blackfish is a Tully, so he needs to figure out how to get River Run back without shedding any Tully blood, and he eventually gets there through using their prisoner Edmure to surrender the castle to him. But in somewhat of the confusion of this kind of changing of the guards and Edmure getting in, we see one of the gates of River Run lifted ever so slightly, and the Blackfish is able to swim out into the night, never to be seen again, at least so far in the main series, though I would bet he's going to come back in the Winds of Winter. As I mentioned, I think there are two main routes that Brendan's character might take in the future of the series, and both of which is founded in some element of his either recent or distant past, and tie in directly to what he seems to value above all else. That being, true to the Tully words, family over duty over honor, as I do believe that the story of Brynden Tully is tied into that of his descendants. I'll call the first angle the Brotherhood route, as there is some evidence that this escape by the Blackfish was at least partially engineered by the Brotherhood without banners, as we do know that Edmure was able to talk unattended to Tom of Seven Strings before re entering River Run. Tom is very well known to be a Brotherhood spy, as we do see a lot of evidence of this throughout the main series as it stands. They're also currently operating in the Riverlands and will likely have a lot to do with the future of the story. And it's also worth noting that the Brotherhood is currently split into two different factions. One of them is being run by his niece, that being Catelyn Stark, resurrected as Lady Stoneheart, though an argument can be made that she's not really Catelyn Stark anymore, but I digress. That is probably very much the truth. I tend to think that Brynden is going to end up cropping up with the other group of the Brotherhood survivors, specifically Edric Dane and Anguy the Archer. Edric is this young man who we meet through Arya's eyes, who seems to be just a nice kid who is currently leading his own faction of the Brotherhood in the Riverlands. And Anguy the Archer, Anguy, I already mispronounced his name, was the guy who won the archery contest at the Hands Tourney and was also traveling with the Brotherhood in season 3 of the show and book 3 of the series. So I do think Brynden very much fits more into that equation than the other half of it. And it is also worth noting that we do encounter Catelyn Stark's contingent of the Brotherhood without banners after Brynden is freed and he is not with them. So I think that if this was an escape engineered by the Brotherhood, it was Edric's half. I want to interrupt myself to ask two questions. One, where do you think Blackfish is headed? Two, what other missing characters would you want me to discuss in the future? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. While you're down there, leave a like, subscribe. I really appreciate it, and it really helps the channel. I believe that this half of the Brotherhood is very likely to feature in the prologue chapter to the Winds of Winter. We've heard a little bit about this chapter via Martin discussing it at things like conventions, and the one thing we know for certain is that Jane Westerling will appear in that chapter. For those who might forget, Jane Westerling was Robb's wife in the books. That was a change in the television show, and we do know that the last time she is seen, she's being kind of transported with a number of prisoners from Riverrun to the Westerlands, and this includes Edmure Tully, the man who just gave Riverrun up and did seemingly communicate with his uncle and arrange his uncle's escape. His uncle might want to return the favor and free Edmure Tully, thus kind of completing this cycle, and it could act as somewhat of a reconciliation moment between Edmure and his uncle Brynden, who have had some tension in the series past. It's also worth noting that there could be more going on there, as I've theorized in the past, that Jane could be pregnant with Robb's heir, which could add a more kind of family angle to Brynden leading this rescue of this group of prisoners. I had also had the thought that Brynden could be the viewpoint character for this prologue chapter, but there are a couple things holding me back from fully endorsing that notion. First and foremost, the prologues so far in even numbered books have had something to do with maesters in general. The second book features Crescent, who is a maester, and the fourth book features Pate, who is an alkalite at the Citadel, where all of the maesters are, and he's talking to maesters for the entire chapter. Brynden is, as far as we know, unfortunately, not a maester. Additionally, we know that prologue and epilogue viewpoints die. That's just what they do. Martin has expressed some desire to break this rule in the series' future, and I could see Edmure being a good candidate to break this rule with, but regardless of that, I don't think he would run the risk of killing Edmure, because I don't think that his story is quite over yet. I think he's going to escape to do something grand, and I could see him going out in a blaze of glory in some manner, but that blaze of glory being kind of unaccompanied in a prologue does seem a little bit weird. The other angle is the Vale discussion. Specifically, Brynden Tully is introduced to us in the Vale, and he has spent a lot of his life in that region. Additionally, he knows for certain that he has family there. The Starks and the Tullys have dropped like flies. He doesn't like Edmure very much. He might feel indebted to Edmure, and that could motivate him to rescue his nephew, but overall, we know he's not a big fan, and he could end up trying to save the one relative he knows who is alive and not currently in Lannister custody, that being Sweet Robin, little Robert Arryn. It would be interesting to see him kind of return to this area where he had been for so long, and now again encounter Sansa, who is there and is unknowingly also Brendan's niece, given the fact that she is currently disguised as Littlefinger's daughter, Elaine Stone. There's also a really cool framing device already baked into the narrative that you could use to introduce Brandon, and it's done really well in Preston Jacobs' second Elaine fanfic chapter for The Winds of Winter, which I would recommend you check out. But specifically, we know there's this upcoming tournament of winged knights in the Vale, and this chapter has him kind of come in as a mystery knight, unknown and upsetting the entire tournament, winning everything, and then ultimately at the end of the chapter, unmasking himself before his sobbing nephew and revealing himself as this old, grizzled war hero who is going to help his nephew reclaim his rights and kingdom, and maybe even help reclaim his other nephew, Edmure. And I do think it's a really interesting way to bring this character back into the fold. And I do think, even removed from that specific framing device, he really works well, Brendan, as a character in the arc in the Vale. Not only is he known to Sweet Robin and one of the few people who could probably comfort him, I think he would have a very interesting role to play in Sansa's development. We've seen the Blackfish counsel Robb, counsel Catelyn, and now he could counsel his other niece. And I think that would be a great way to develop both of these characters. I think Sansa is someone who's very much coming into her own as this political player, as this force to be reckoned with, and I would love to see Brynden as sort of the angel on her shoulder to Littlefinger's more negative influence. And I think specifically those two characters could have a very interesting relationship, as don't forget, Littlefinger was warded at Riverrun, and they do know each other quite well. In fact, that night when Littlefinger got drunk and tried to get with Catelyn and then ended up getting with Lysa, it was the Blackfish who carried him off to bed. So there is so much history there that it would be really interesting to explore, and is probably a at least more fascinating long-term angle for the character going forward. Overall, I am fascinated to see where Blackfish's future might go in the Winds of Winter. He's someone who I do not think will survive the wars to come, but I think how he dies is going to be really fascinating to see, as there are so many different plot threads and elements that could reconvene or he could tie into in some way or another, and it would lead to a very satisfying resolution to not only his own arc, but a complication to others' arcs going forward. He's one of a million Chekhov's guns floating around Westeros, and I, for one, am very excited to see how it goes off. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. It really helps the channel, and I just really appreciate it. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. Which angle do you think it'll take? Have I just forgotten something entirely? I'd love to hear your opinion. I'm sure I've forgotten a million things. I'll have many more videos for you on A Song of Ice and Fire, House of the Dragon, Game of Thrones, and Dunk and Egg in the very near future. Thank you again so much for watching, and I will see you all soon. Goodbye, everyone.